All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. For anyone who is listening to the show for the first time today, let me welcome you. Everyone else, what's up? How's everyone doing? First, let me thank those of you who reached out to wish me a happy birthday. I do appreciate that. If you weren't here last week, I mentioned it. I turned 53 years old this week. And for those of you who are yoga teachers who are maybe getting more on in years as I am, you might appreciate that for some reason this year, turning 53, the fact that I was a yoga teacher really did feel like it sets me apart more than at any other time in my life. Like, I became a yoga teacher in my early 20s in New York City in the 90s and the early aughts, and there was nothing unusual about being a male yoga teacher at that time in my 20s. In fact, it was a very kind of rock star, counterculture, cool thing to do. That's why I did it, I think. And as I got older, even when I, got into my 30s and even my 40s, and I got married and I had a child and I was in Brooklyn and I was at the elementary school talking with other parents and told them I was a yoga teacher, the reaction I would get or the kind of subtle communication, even if it's unspoken, that would happen was not that I was this weird, unusual thing. In fact, there would often be maybe even other male yoga teachers who had kids at the school, when I was in Brooklyn. It wasn't that weird. But now that I'm in my 50s and I live in Easton, Pennsylvania, it really is unusual. In fact, I think I could say with some confidence that of the 300 or so kids at the elementary school that my youngest daughter attends, I am likely the only dad who's a yoga teacher at that whole school. And I was talking to my eldest daughter, who's 15, soon to be 16, and she was telling me about her friends and their parents and their dads, and I think there's maybe a good chance that I'm maybe the only yoga teacher dad at the high school, which is a couple of thousand kids. It's just something that's changed over the years, that me being a yoga teacher seems to be a weird thing to other people. And I think why is because there's these notions of what a yoga teacher is to people who don't have maybe direct experience with it. I think there's this idea of it being, stretching, a fitness thing, or maybe a mental health thing, and maybe a little bit of a potentially spiritual path. But I just think people don't associate dads being yoga teachers in their 50s or whatever. And I think the other thing that really struck me about it is that if I'm having a conversation with another dad and we're discussing what we do for work, what our occupations are, there's no other situations where their occupation is also their spiritual path. Maybe, I guess, if somebody whose kid is a pastor or something, that would equal it. But there aren't other jobs where your job is also your spiritual practice or your beliefs, your spiritual beliefs. And if it is yoga and it's spiritual, it's not religious. That's where the whole spiritual but not religious thing comes from, because being a spiritual yogi and somehow isn't supposed to be a religion. But as I've discussed on this show, that's gotten a lot more blurry, what we mean by religion or religious. It can vary depending on someone's viewpoint or the context of what we're talking about. So in any case, I don't know. I was feeling a little bit maybe lonely or feeling set apart from people. I guess I connect with a lot of people online through this show in ways that, reaffirm the choices that I've made, but in my immediate sphere in my life, I'm a freak. I'm a total freak. And I'm cool with that. But I don't know, from like a kind of almost like sociological or anthropological stance, I'm looking at myself and being like, wow, you are really a weird dude. Which brings me to my conversation today with Paul Bramadat. Paul is the director for the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at the University of Victoria and the author of a new book called Yogalands, In Search of Practice on the Mat and in the World. And I mentioned it to Paul at the beginning. I'll say a little more here, in that somebody reached out to me about Paul and his new book. And when I took a look at the description of the book, it was hitting on all of these themes that are like the mainstay of this show, like some of the ideas and things that I've been asking about and searching about in myself and talking about on the show for the last decade were sort of questions that were being asked even in just like the description of the book. And I thought, oh, wow, this is definitely up my alley. However, when I looked at like Paul's bio and I saw that he's this academic of sorts, I'm like, oh no, because I feel like I've lived yoga coming into the mainstream, and even some of the things I was pointing to in terms of like the weird mix of religious and spiritual and practice and profession, all of these things that intersect in me, in my life, to have some dispassionate academic analyzing it would be like, oh, I don't know. But what I quickly learned is that Paul isn't only coming from a dispassionate academic viewpoint, because he himself has had transformative experience of yoga practice. And I've had scholar practitioners on the show before, but I feel like Paul has a really interesting take, and the research that he's done asks some very important questions that I think is really good for me and the people who listen to this show to consider. So it was a great pleasure to connect with Paul, and I'm very happy to be bringing it to you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention that if you enjoy this show and you would like to support it and get access to the full-length archives, I want to encourage you to become a podcast premium subscriber. We are not running ads on this show, and I've discussed this many times. I could probably be making more money if I was, but there's so many issues with that, and the way that we are able to keep this going is through listener support, through podcast premium subscriptions. For as little as $5 a month, you could make a big impact and help me keep doing this. And not to mention, the archives of the full-length episodes is quite a resource if you haven't listened to that stuff. So again, if you are in a position to do so and you value what you're getting here, please consider becoming a podcast premium subscriber. And if you would like to connect with me in other ways outside of listening to the show, there's lots of opportunities for us to do that. I've got ongoing live classes and a weekly discussion group and a teacher training program. You can find all of my stuff, podcast premium and the rest, at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, let's leave it there. I will touch base with you on the other side. But for now, let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Paul Bramadat. Hello.
Hey,
Hi, Paul. Nice to meet you.
you too, man. Wicked shirt.
Oh, thank you. Well, I don't know if you listened to the show before. I'm already recording, so if it's okay with you, I'd like for us to consider ourselves having just begun. Would that be all right?
Sure, no problem at all.
Well, I've been very much enjoying reading through your book. I haven't gotten all the way through it, but I've gotten a good way through it, Paul. Your book, Yogalands. And it's a pleasure to have this moment to speak with you. Thank you for making the time to do this. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm honored to be included. The list of people you've talked to and the podcasts I've enjoyed are just so incredible. So thanks very much for your interest.
Oh, no. Well, I mean, you can imagine if you looked at the show some, like what you're talking about or some of the questions you're asking in your book. Some of these are like the main themes of this show over the years.
Yeah.
I even like reading through some of the sections. I'll share with you that when I first got the email about you, about potentially coming on the show, and I looked at your bio and I saw that you were, you know, an academic, the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. And like, I, I get a little intimidated by academics sometimes because I'm not an academic myself. I've certainly done a fair amount of study and tried to do my own sort of scholarship, but never like at a college, like just on my own.
Yeah.
So I've always over the years been a little bit intimidated by folks who have those kinds of credentials. But I
Yeah.
gotta say, I was quite delightfully surprised while I was reading the book because you also have the practitioner side, the scholar practitioner side. And even it seems to me, and we can talk about it some, that you had what I would often refer to, I don't know if you'd agree with the terminology, but some sort of transformational experience through practice.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, because not everybody likes
Yeah.
the word transformational, but to me,
No, man, I'm good with it.
it seemed to me you'd had that experience, and sometimes that hands-on practitioner experience is what it feels like is lacking from a more dispassionate kind of academic consideration of these things.
Yeah, totally. And in many ways, a lot of the issues I think you've been posing in your own life, as I read your own bio and as I hear your stories, are echoed in the book. Absolutely. And I don't come to this as a yoga scholar who's wise in the ways of Sanskrit, and not at all. I'm actually quite new to yoga studies as a kind of like a field of study. I'm a scholar of religion, and I had totally put yoga on the back burner. It wasn't really an interesting topic for me academically until the transformation.
Interesting. We can talk about
Yeah,
that.
totally. Let's do
But
it.
what I do think you're right. I think my sort of story or whatever is like a case study in kind of what you're looking at. I mean, even just
Yep.
to kind of set a stage for us and for you to kind of know where I'm coming from. You've read a little bit.
Hmm.
Like I grew up in I guess what you would call conservative Jewish household in the 80s in Los Angeles.
Hmm.
For folks who don't know, I guess conservative would be sort of between like reform, which was very kind of moving away from orthodox, which was the other end of the spectrum, and somewhere in the middle was conservative.
Yeah.
I personally was quite a like kiss-ass kid and a drama kid, so I was very active. Like at my bar mitzvah, normally you do your Haftorah portion.
Yeah.
I did all the Torah portions at my bar mitzvah, and I
What?
had
Show
people
off.
come up to me and say, "Oh, it's so nice to see a young man taking such an active role in their Judaic education." But for me, I just could memorize really good, and
Yeah.
I remember at age 16, I actually read translations of all of these prayers that I knew by heart
Yeah.
and determined that I didn't believe any of this.
Yikes.
And I remember telling my father, saying to him, "I'm not going to temple anymore. I don't believe any of this." And he said, to his credit, "I don't believe it either, but your mom does, so you're going." And honestly, that was good enough for me. Like if I didn't
Yeah.
have to believe it and it was for my mom, then I was kind of okay with that.
Mhm.
But I mention it because I do think it was sort of a rejection of like Judeo-Christian religion,
Yeah.
which I came to associate with just like, hierarchical, patriarchal control, suppression of the feminine. Like I
Yep.
associated religion with all these horrible injustices and things. And yoga came into my life as kind of a way to touch something ancient and sacred. And I definitely was a spiritual but not religious person. At least I saw it that way for a long time.
Yep.
And, I would also say I was very inspired by TKV Desikachar, and he certainly presented it in ways in which he said yoga is not religion explicitly. He encouraged chanting. I grappled with the same cultural appropriation questions that I think a lot of folks like myself have grappled with over the years. But I've been chanting the Gayatri mantra for 30 years.
Yeah.
And I never thought of it as prayer for a long time. But I do now, actually. Yeah, that's changed a lot. But all of this is to say that I think that yoga really was a way for someone to experience what would be religion, but we were not thinking of it as religion. It was a way to not have it be religious.
Yeah, absolutely. And my area really is kind of all the ways in which religion or religion-ish issues still show up in our lives, show up in our culture, show up in our pop culture as well. And I'm not really hung up on saying this is religious, that's not religious. I'm actually more interested in the stories people tell. So when a yoga teacher is standing right beside a statue of Ganesh and they're wearing mala beads, 108 mala beads, and they are about to start the Ashtanga invocation or the Iyengar invocation, which is like full of religious symbolism and has this long, rich theological, spiritual, textual history. So when a teacher is standing like that about to do this thing and they say, this isn't about religion. I mean, again, my job is not, I don't really have a horse in the race. My job isn't to correct them. It's just to say, isn't it interesting that we all feel quite comfortable hearing that this is spiritual, not religious, and don't pay any attention to the fact that this is a Hindu god and there's a reason for the 108 beads and here's what the invocation means in Sanskrit. Because people are making their own meanings out of these things, which is, again, totally fine. And I think most of my fellow students that I practice with every morning, they make their own meanings out of these things. They're not fussy about this or that theological claim or this or that, text, which comes first and who wrote it. And they're not fussy about that, whereas in your case, you're talking about your story with Judaism, right? At some point, the meaning, the philosophical meaning of those texts started to bug you because you couldn't really accept it. But here you come into a yoga context where the philosophical meaning isn't necessarily what really draws people. It's some kind of connection to their body. It's some kind of connection to some ineffable higher sense of the self in the kind of Patanjalian sense.
Well, and as you point to in your book as well, a lot of us, there's some kind of like inflection thing in life or traumatic thing. For me, my mom passed away when I was a young boy, and yoga had to do with kind of reconciling that loss, I think.
Yeah. And it was useful, it sounds like.
It absolutely was. I wouldn't still be caring about it for all these years. And I guess I'm curious because I did read that you have some Indian heritage in your family, but you weren't exposed to yoga at a younger age, or yoga wasn't like a thing in your life at an earlier time?
No, yeah. I mean, my dad was Indo-Trinidadian, so he's part of that indentured labor migration pattern that they left India once the slaves were freed, so-called freed. The British Empire had to bring in Indians to continue to run the economies of the West Indies, and my father's ancestors would have been among that group. And so the story that I was raised on was that the family were these Brahmins, hence my last name, and that they reestablished themselves in Trinidad, at which point they converted to Christianity. And my father, he was, as Max Weber would say, he was religiously unmusical. He had no interest in any of that stuff. But nonetheless, the story stuck to him. The Brahmin story stuck to him, and that was passed on to me. But yoga was never passed on as part of that story. So it wasn't until I was in my mid-40s and my knees basically just blew up with arthritis. I had a wall with my body, and my knees were just done. And I was in this kind of crisis moment of my body breaking down. That's sort of how I that's how I went to yoga. But as a half Indian person, I felt some squeamishness about being in that space, but not as much squeamishness as some of my white colleagues would feel. They'd be freaking out, right? I was kind of like, well, this is interesting. I don't feel like a total intruder. And initially I was just interested in kind of Indic physiotherapy. That like I didn't want anything to do with the other stuff that I thought was probably down there. But once the emergency was fixed and I could actually walk again, you make one mistake and scratch the surface, and you think, "Ooh, look at that!" And you start to be curious about all the other stuff that's down there underneath the asana practice. Which the asana practice was extremely useful for me. It really gave me my body back. But then I thought, well, there's this whole other thing going on there, and I began to get curious about that other thing. And then I promised myself, look, you're going to wreck this beautiful experience if you apply your academic tools to that experience. So I thought, it's okay. I'll just keep doing my research on other stuff, vaccines and radicalization and immigration issues. That was my kind of area. And I thought, and then this yoga thing will happen over here in the mornings. I'm not going to be analyzing it. It's not going to be a topic of research. But then, bad habits, good habits, I don't know, habits, you start pulling threads, right? And you see that everything's connected to everything else. And you start getting curious. And you think, maybe I could actually apply my academic training to this thing over here. And so at Yogalands, the book is really the kind of product of that.
That's very interesting to me. I guess I'm curious, leading up to your knees going out or your body breaking down, which I've talked about that a bunch of times, even on the show. Like, pain has a way of stripping us down to like essential human directives sometimes. And also, just to say, I really relate to the way you were sort of almost kind of compartmentalizing it out. I tend to be over analytical. So for me, like things like chanting or certain things that I've done over the years, I've just kind of put them over there. I never really thought, like I said, I never thought about it as prayer. Just like this thing I do, just sound vibrations I'm making, because I didn't want to overanalyze it or mess with the experience, which was really serving me. So I get that. But I guess I'm curious, like leading up to before your body broke down, you were in religious studies. So what drew you to focusing your career on religious studies? Were you religious yourself, or was it a more academic consideration of these things?
Yeah, I mean, I was raised by my mother is a Unitarian minister. And so I was raised in this super liberal, post-religious, vaguely spiritual context. But by the time I was in my 20s, I had kind of checked out of those issues. And it was a strictly intellectual, philosophical pursuit. Nonetheless, I saw religion as interesting because it was a kind of a vehicle for thinking about political change, for thinking about art, for thinking about suffering. So there was a way in which I was kind of primed for actually kind of, as it were, finding a religion in the sense of finding yoga as a spiritual path, which I now think of yoga as really my spiritual path. And so I was primed for it because I already had been looking at religion as this complex historical thing, which was also a complex political thing, which was also a site for art and beauty and a context in which people dealt with their suffering and their mortality. So in some sense, I was primed for it. And then when I had my own suffering and grapplings with mortality and this sense of crisis in my own life, I thought, well, here's this thing called yoga, and I am half Indian. And so it's not totally terrible that I'm poking around in this thing. But my great fear was that I would kill it, like a lot of people who love reading novels when they're 12 and 13 and 15, and then they go into university and become English majors. And a lot of them, it's a heartbreak because their English professors teach them to look at novels in a way which takes all the joy out of it. And I was worried about that, but it quite the opposite happened for me, actually. And that's been a real revelation in a sense that I can be fully engaged intellectually and not wreck what my heart and my body are telling me.
I mean, very interesting. It does seem like there are aspects to yoga, and you point to this in the book, because there was kind of like a secularization of yoga as it got brought into the mainstream. And that's like, I'm also another case study, because I came into yoga in the early 90s when it was still underground. It was still like church basements and, community halls. There weren't like these spa environments or like VC-backed corporate yoga chains. None of that had happened yet.
Right.
And sort of like it came into it still felt like a mystical tradition. That's why I was into it. It was countercultural move. And it was a way to kind of get beyond what I consider to be like a reductionist, materialistic lens of life into a consciousness-based reality that has morphic resonance. And, I've had all these people that come on, they have all these science experiments doing MRIs or whatever on people's brains for whatever, non-local consciousness. Yoga represented in Eastern spirituality represented to me like this way more open lens.
Mm-hmm. But it felt safe, it sounds like, right? That
if someone said I get to decide. I get to decide. It wasn't like somebody was dictating. Now, that was my own bent, because within yoga, and I've since learned this, it's a pretty wide spectrum. You've got atheistic yogis to theistic yogis and all this stuff in between.
Totally. And you've got the hardcore lineage people, and then the people who are more, eccentric or, cut and paste or pick and choose. And so you have this huge range, as one has within Judaism or Christianity, right? You've got this huge range.
I've learned that. But I would say that, well, before I get into that, I'm getting ahead of myself. I guess I'm still curious to know, so for you were doing religious studies. Was there like a kind of specific area of focus in that for you personally, in that research and that work that you did before yoga kind of became more of a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in kind of religion and politics, but small p politics. So religion and vaccine hesitancy, religion and bioregionalism. So like why it is people on the west coast of Canada and the United States, we live in a different space compared to the rest of North America. So why is religion and spirituality kind of weird out here? So that's my last book. I'm interested in kind of radical countercultural expressions of religion and spirituality. So that's always been my bent. I don't do ancient texts. I don't do ancient languages. I don't dig things up out of the earth. I'm much more interested in kind of religion that might show up at a potluck you might go to, or a kitchen table party you're at, right? And someone says, "Oh, I hate religion because," or "your weird uncle," or whatever. I'm interested in religion in those kinds of ways, right? So the ways it enters pop culture, the ways it enters your ordinary life.
I see. And when you first started going to yoga classes, it was because you were in pain. You didn't think of it as like a spiritual pursuit, like you said earlier, that it was a spiritual path. It was just to like address the pain issues.
Yeah, it was really just kind of a physiotherapy. And I have a colleague at work I work with, and he's this sort of Greek god figure, physically kind of, rode at a very high level for Yale and super fancy, incredibly fit guy. And I was complaining to him about my knees having essentially broken. And he said, "Oh, you should try yoga." And I was like, "Oh, dude, I don't really think I want to be that guy who comes to the West Coast and, gets a kayak and gets a tattoo and, does yoga and changes my name and gets
There were
whatever."
some cliches that were true, weren't there?
Yeah, that's right. And I said, I didn't want to be that guy. But my friend, who is this sort of, kind of almost like a caricature of a fit man at that time, for sure, said, "I'll just give it a try." And so I tried it, and it was, this incredible experience that really.
So your first class, you had an immediate experience with it?
Yeah, I thought something. I thought something really unusual just happened to me, and so I kept going back, thinking, just sort of sniffing around, like this feels kind of good, and it's. I don't know quite on what level of my body it's working, but it's sort of working. And then within about 3 weeks, I kind of had it bad. Like I was pretty set.
Now, was this first class that you're going to, this was an Ashtanga class? Because I read that you were an Ashtanga practitioner. So your first practice was Ashtanga, like a Mysore room or like lead primary? What are we talking about?
It was a very chill, what they used to call a community class. So, I now teach. So it's what we think of now as a basics class, kind of like a half primary, but the greatest hits.
Right.
But the nice thing was that when I went in there, the guy who owned the studio, Jeff Lichty, sort of saw through me immediately, because he was my age, former paramedic. I told him what was happening with my knees, and he led me into the class, and it was very kind and lots of adjustments with lots of care and kind of knowledge of me and what it was like to be a guy in his mid-40s with his body betraying him. So I think if I'd gone into another Ashtanga studio with a super aggressive, competitive, ultra, like a supermodel, I might have said, I'm out, because I needed some care and some TLC. that day.
Well, it's interesting because I've just put out a couple of episodes because, recently there's been some controversy since Sharat Joyce's passing, in terms of like, well, who's the authority now? Like, if you have this, like, if you have a subjective thing where this person is the one who decides whether or not you're qualified to be authorized or certified, and then that person dies, what happens? Who takes it over?
I know.
And even just in terms of like the way that people have taught, and in the past, I mean, I've talked about this when I went to a Mysore room in like the 90s, the late 90s, like it wasn't what you got. It was pretty hardcore. And if you couldn't do stuff, you got sent to the back of the room. It was very intimidating.
Yep.
I think there's been an evolution, and that's kind of what I've been asking, like, oh, has it softened? Has there been some, and it seems like teachers like the one that you went to, and I did listen to your talk with him, which was very cool. He seems to be an example of someone who got something from the system, but also gave himself permission or got permission. I don't know his story enough to not have to stick to certain dogmas or certain things that other people might have been sticking to. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, that's totally true. Yeah. And, even when I went into his Mysore space and the teachers that he was teaching, and his partner at the time, Harmony Slater, they ran a very solid Mysore program, and it was really good for me. I think I started it at about maybe 3 or 4 months after I started going to all these community type classes. And, they were teaching the sequence. They were being serious about it. They were being serious about adjustments and all that. But there was no shaming. There was no go to the back of the room. There was no, you should definitely be able to do this by now. There was none of that. They were very calm and compassionate. So that I really appreciated it. And I wouldn't have stayed if there was any of the kind of ego bashing, shaming. I couldn't have stayed, I think. So I'm very grateful that I just happened to walk into that space. And now, I like you, I've seen the crisis within the Ashtanga world over what to do in the sort of post-Sharat world. And it's really hard to know what's going on. But the research study that animated Yogalands was, I went to all different kinds of studios and practiced with lots of different teachers, Iyengar, Ashtanga, all kinds of various hatha styles, hot yoga, I did the whole thing.
Well, I've spoken to Harmony, and she certainly seems to kind of represent, again, this thoughtful approach to the tradition of Ashtanga yoga, and very open just in terms of grappling with everything that's been revealed over the years, and even in terms of the hands-on adjustments. I guess what's intriguing to me about that, even in your instance, is I've not really associated the Ashtanga system with a therapeutic orientation a lot of times, especially because of like all the lotus work and half lotus, like for knees. Like I blew out one of my knees doing Marichasana D. So, for me, I have like deep scarring around some of those poses. And again, if you're allowed to modify it, then it's not an issue. But if it has to be done a particular way, then that's some other story. I guess for you in doing the Ashtanga work and what was going on with your body, what do you think it was that the physical practice was doing to help your knees? Was it just like an overall, like more embodiment, or how do you understand it now in terms of how it addressed what had been a debilitating situation for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think you could, at the mechanical level, I think all the muscles in my knees and my hips and my back were being kind of restructured or woken up, you could say, and realigned and re-strengthened. And so, because I used to be a runner and a soccer player before, that's kind of how I blew out my knees. And I think in some sense, a slow entry into the Ashtanga system or into any this kind of seriously supported yogic context helped me to kind of strengthen all the muscles in my legs and hips that then gave my knees some room to grow, or to not to grow, but to be healthy again. But I think more than anything, it was kind of the pairing of the breath with the movement, and the way the teachers drew attention to the way my ego was getting in the way often. So speaking of half lotus or full lotus, at one point I was super frustrated because Jeff was trying to show me how to get into full lotus or half lotus. And I swore and he heard me swear under my breath because I just thought, I'm never going to do this. And I was looking at all these people around me doing it, no problem, right? All these 22-year-olds.
Mm.
And I was at this point, I was 47, 48 at that point. And he said, why are you so upset? And I sort of gestured to this guy beside me and I said, I'll never do that. That'll never happen for me.
Mm.
And he just looked at me and he said, and what if it didn't? And walked away.
Hmm.
And it was one of the best gifts he could give me, because he made me sit with myself and to ask myself, what am I actually doing here? Am I trying to pretend I'm a 22-year-old with nice rubbery knees? And am I getting super attached to achieving this or that posture? And in a funny way, because he forced me to look at myself really closely, and it wasn't a very pretty picture, frankly, the ego was really running that show, I backed off on trying to get it. And then, I don't know, 2 months later, I got it. 2 months later, just by slowly, compassionately dealing with my hips opening up and all that, then I was able to. But it was because of the ego work, the breath work, and the body work.
I get it. But I guess I do this almost always when I talk to Ashtanga people, because I still think that, and even I heard you talking in some other talks that you gave about the book, where people were asking you even about the pictures that you've chosen and a certain veneration of poses.
Mm-hmm.
And while I think that most of the people I know who are deep Ashtangis, like yourself, it sounds like they don't have this experience that I'm referring to. Their experience of the system is different than mine, and I want to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
But, because it is a kind of series, and there's a veneration of people who can execute this series, even the way you're authorized to teach up to the pose that you can do, physically.
Yeah.
That sets up a certain dynamic for me that I personally would find kind of counterproductive to a healing process, because I'll give you some examples. For me, I was quite proficient at handstand presses. I could put my hands down and press up to a handstand. So I could press up to a handstand and lower to Chaturanga instead of jumping back.
Nice.
But I could never jump through with straight legs, because the proportion of my torso and my upper body and my arms were such, it wasn't a lack of strength or will, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It was just a structural thing in my body where I could never hover with my hands down like they would do,
Yeah.
And that create a whole thing, So again, I acknowledge that I don't know that would be everybody's experience, but I guess for me, it seemed to me you even talk about teachers who can do these poses as sort of examples of these heroes.
Yeah.
And that makes me nervous that we make the hero about being able to do the body position.
Yeah. I mean, again, so my training is kind of anthropological, sociological, or as we say, qualitative methods. And all that really means is that when I go into a space and I start eavesdropping or doing focus groups or interviews or just watching the ways people move through their yoga studios, I try to go into it with a kind of a non-judgmental headspace. And so what I noticed, and so in one of the chapters, which is really on the Jivan Mukta, the person who I use the term quite loosely in the book, but it's the person who is this sort of special figure in many yoga studios, and you can see them all over the internet on Instagram, especially. These people who seem to be able to do anything and seem to be able to, be doing anything while they're cooking dinner. They can put their legs behind their head or something crazy like that. And I'm actually, as a sociologist, anthropologist kind of person, I'm just interested in the ways they get storied, the ways these kind of these people who are super gifted in so many ways get storied. And they do get storied as being, I would say, almost categorically different than you and me. In other words, I might struggle with this. I might have sore hips, or I might not be able to do the kind of swing through that you're talking about with straight legs. But these people can seem to do anything, and they have a different kind of vibe around them. It's kind of a different aura. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm not trying to say that that's the right way to organize a studio. I'm simply saying that's the way a lot of studios actually are organized, which is around these heroic figures. Should it be that way? Nah. And could I be in a studio where not only do these people exist, but they are in this whole different type of social class, in other words, and they're bossing people around and they're cruel to people, or they belittle the people who come in totally broken or obese or disabled or whatever. No, I could never tolerate that in a studio. But do I understand how it comes to pass that such people have this aura of specialness? I mean, if you just watch someone like Michael Jordan in his prime, he could just do things that like a normal person couldn't do. Or you watch a great actor or a great poet perform their poetry. There's a kind of a charisma about them. And so as an outsider, I'm both an insider and an outsider, but to walk into a space and to sort of see the way the special people are treated, whether it's a math genius, a basketball genius, a yoga genius, there's a kind of a way in which they're treated specially. And as long as they're not lording that over people and hurting people with that specialness, or the charisma that's granted to them, then I'm okay. I'm also able to say, look, that person seems to be somewhat of a special creature in this space.
That's very interesting, because it seems like a lot of times in the yoga world, certainly when I first got into it, the way that people had credibility was their connection to a master, to a yoga master, somebody who was bestowing ancient wisdom, and they were part of the parampara of passing that wisdom. At some point that did sort of shift and change. And part of that was because so many of these master guru figures did have falls from grace, as we know. And it does seem like part of what's happened since, when it has more to do with like the charisma of the teacher sometimes. And whether or not that, like you just said, that was going to be my question, because sometimes people talk about charisma as it fundamentally being a bad thing that we should all distrust.
No.
And I wouldn't think that that's true. I think what I've talked a lot about, that some people I've observed, and I would put myself in this camp, we've tried to kind of come with a certain transparency, like on a certain learning in public or something that our teachers didn't do, to try to like mitigate some of these pitfalls that we've seen others fall into.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about your take on the politics, because you talked about that's where you came from. And I recently had some conversations here on the show about like the role of a yoga teacher in terms of like speaking about politics or advocating for politics. And, I talked about, I had Reggie Hubbard, I just recorded with him. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's quite activist and kind of like a political operative, as well as a yoga teacher. And I was talking about how in like a certain period of time, like 2017 to 2019, like the yoga world got real political. And I just remember this show became like a kind of hotbed of me trying to like talk about all these things. And at a certain point, I just made a conscious choice. Like, I don't think like I know enough about these things, or like I'm out of my scope of practice here. Like yoga teachers don't know everything about geopolitics enough to be having informed conversations always. So I just made kind of a conscious choice to not have this be a space to like talk about things in a certain way. And I think over the years, and it's changed some, especially in the last few years, where like I had someone on recently named Norman Blair, who's somebody who really does bring politics into his class in a very direct way. He's quite vocal about his stance on Israel-Palestine situation, and we talk about that. It's the first time I brought anything political on the show in a while, and even still, it did cause quite an uproar, especially that particular issue. But I guess I understand what I think you're saying is that it is sort of fundamentally political, like yoga, even in terms of like where it fits into the context of somebody's life. And even if we don't think of it, it is still in certain ways. But do you have, I don't know if it's a stance, or did you come to anything in the interviews that you did about what are the kind of appropriate roles, like for a yoga teacher to like bring political issues into their Dharma talks, into their classes? I feel like myself and a lot of other people have felt like, wouldn't we want yoga spaces to be a place where people who are on different sides of the political aisle could be in the same room and all do breathing and moving exercises?
Yeah.
Doesn't there want to be a certain neutral aspect to like potentially make bridges that yoga could represent?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's such a good topic. I mean, so I did focus groups, interviews, traveled around North America, and I did a big survey of Canadian and American yoga practitioners. So it was a pretty big study. And that was one of the questions I did ask is, what's the appropriate place of capital P politics in a yoga space? And there actually did seem, I think you were kind of pointing to it, there did seem to be a kind of a consensus that that's not the appropriate place to bring in capital P politics about Trump and women's rights to choose and so forth. And yet, I think the other thing you're pointing to is something I do talk about a fair bit in the book is the ways in which yoga spaces are kind of this small p political spaces. In other words, to create a space, a welcoming, warm, clean, quiet, slow space that people can seek refuge in. Their lives are fast, dirty and noisy,
plugged into the matrix or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And to sort of unplug yourself from the matrix for an hour or two, and to be in a space which you feel familiar with. So if you're in Detroit or Winnipeg or Victoria or Barcelona, if you go into something called a yoga studio, you're going to feel like you're in a kind of a common space, right?
I've traveled all over the world, and that is absolutely true. Like yoga spaces, there's something universal there. And even people who spoke different languages with me with translators, it felt the same.
Totally. And even if you were just practicing, if you just had a home practice, right? There's a way in which many of us who have a home practice will roll out our mats and make sure that the space is quiet, clean, and slow. That the kids are on the other side of a door, the dogs are, that things are kind of managed in such a way that you can have that 12 square foot of rubber be kind of your sort of sacred space for that hour. And so that's why the book is called Yogalands, because I'm imagining all those spaces being connected, kind of like this matrix of spaces and times that are connected, that take you out of the regular chaos and terror and anxiety and dirtiness and speed and awfulness that it is the life of many of us outside of the yoga studio. And so some critics would say, well, really then all yoga is doing is a kind of, it's giving people a sort of a kind of an opium, so that's why, so Marx's idea that
it's all just
opium of the masses.
Rainbows and butterflies and everybody's just avoiding stuff and putting their head in the sand or whatever.
Yeah, so that's the critique, and I take the critique seriously. I mean, the idea that yoga is just a distraction from how horrible the world is. So I take the critique seriously, but I don't think that it's adequate, because I think that on the one hand, that hour or 2 hours a week or a day that you might spend in a studio or on your mat in this kind of set apart space, that actually has a kind of a revolutionary impact in a slow, humble, modest sense, in the sense that it equips you to be in your body when you go back out into the world and you are managing your duties as a father or an accountant or a bricklayer or whatever your thing is. And there's something just about that hour of safety and comfort and quiet and control and the kind of a clean space that is restorative and therefore, I think, in a strange way, political. So you don't need a teacher to say, okay, now, since you're finished this class, go out and vote for this resolution or go out and donate to this charity.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.